look at
So we
ASAP.
have to, yeah, we have to look at the ASAP.
Okay. And everyone's good with withdrawal?
Yeah. So anything on those withdrawal syndrome definition or opioid use disorder addiction definition?
I would just reverse the order when we put it in the guideline.
Good.
Can I ask a question? So, I'm sorry, with the definitions, what would the order be then for the definitions?
Well, I think tapering definition, then tolerance, then opiate withdrawal syndrome definition, and then opiate withdrawal definition.
Okay.
Because the withdrawal syndrome actually says what that is,
Yeah.
and then the
Yep.
other one references it
Yep, good.
without the definition. Taper, tolerance, withdrawal.
I got it.
Then, yeah, I got it.
Syndrome, okay. I wasn't sure if you were also talking about.
No, it's just swapping the withdrawal definition with the withdrawal syndrome symbol.
Yeah, I wasn't sure about the
Appropriately
rest.
perceived.
Okay. Next page. Anything on the use disorder addiction definition? Are folks ready to look at opioid dependence definition? So this is now we've gotten out of the DSM-5 arena.
DSM-6.
Yeah. So take a look down at the bottom of page 2 of this document.
Just for clarity, when we were capturing terms in the last conversation that we needed to fill out definitions, it was thrown out to capture the term opioid dependence. That's when we dove further, and this is what we pulled out, which pulls up the COPD definition. So we don't need to keep the term opioid. We can name this whatever we want and incorporate whatever you guys recommend.
Go ahead, Kim.
Dependence in opioids is tricky, right? Because we do use the term when we talk about physiological dependence, psychological dependence, but as a diagnostic criteria, we don't use it anymore in the DSM-5. And so I'm just thinking of the complexity of the word dependence when we talk about opioids, and I'm weighing the value of being that complex in the definition, and I guess I'd be open to feedback on that, just because there's more to it than that. And then is it worth just calling out complex persistent opioid dependence as part of or separate is sort of where my thoughts are kind of going, and I guess I would just put that out for discussion.
Folks have thoughts? Please, BJ.
I would just say that I think that the current iteration of dependence in the DSM-5 is now criteria K for opioid use disorder criteria, and so to confuse that with another definition of dependence would just confuse people, I think. So I'm in agreement.
You're in agreement that we'll just use
that I'm not sure that it does us a favor by defining opioid dependence outside of the complex, persistent opioid dependence. It's not a diagnosis so much anymore, like the other headers are.
Right.
It's a criteria of one diagnosis.
So you would just say, you would just define complex, persistent opioid dependence.
Yeah, and I might point out somehow that K is criteria K in opioid use disorder is really physiologic dependence or dependence how we talk about it today. Does that make sense?
Go ahead, Paul.
I don't understand. Have we moved on to complex persistent dependence?
Yes.
Okay, but that's a very debatable topic.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's what we're talking. We're debating.
Okay, so for example, what that basically does, unfortunately, and Jane's a hero of mine, is it endorses a subset of patients who are benefiting from high-dose opioids. And there is no data to support a subset of patients that benefits from high-dose opioids. None. So, I will acquiesce to the group like I did with our guidelines, but calling it something other than opioid use disorder or narrow spectrum opioid use disorder is a shill. It's a shill. And you're doing that for patient satisfaction or because the patient can't palate the diagnosis of opioid use disorder. Because think of a circumstance where a patient on high-dose opioids is going to be safer on the high-dose opioids than they would be on tapering or transitioning to buprenorphine. There isn't a circumstance. So I don't believe in complex persistent. I think that's a unicorn.
So Eve. And then Jim.
Actually,
Is that this?
yep, turn
Yes.
yours off and still David's. Batteries, please.
Turn it on. Alright, I'm getting
Good at this,
There you go.
turning on microphones.
Let's take that one away.
So, I wonder if it might turn out that complex persistent opioid dependence happens before a use disorder is diagnosed, and that a person's maintained on high dose opioids, and so you won't meet criteria for a use disorder because the medical system is kind of supporting
MAT with a Schedule 2.
ish, that's a way to put it. It might be that those two things end up related, and just when one starts to taper, it might turn into a use disorder, but just couldn't be diagnosed until the taper starts. I've seen things like that happen in practice. I had one just teeny little nitpicky thing that's driving me a little nuts, so I want to throw it out
Do
there. So back to the opioid use disorder definition, the very last sentence at the bottom, severity is specified as, we've used the word symptoms instead of the above criteria, and some of those criteria list multiple symptoms, and some of the symptoms aren't criteria, so I would rather use the word criteria rather than symptoms.
Got it.
I'm
No,
done
that,
nitpicking now.
no,
Thanks
that,
a lot.
that is,
You mean the 2 to 3 criteria instead of
Yeah.
symptoms? Got it.
yep,
Replace the word symptoms with criteria.
Yep.
That's what I'm writing.
good. Okay, so I want to hear from, and so here's what I'm going to, so just so I want to be sure, I'm sort of tracking all this, is that, Paul, I hear that you're saying you have concern about defining complex persistent opioid
Where's the ICD-10 for that?
dependence. Right, okay.
That
Go
hasn't
ahead.
been vetted.
Go ahead.
Okay, so there is a group of us, Paul and myself included, that's been sort of hashing this over for almost a year now. And if I can distill it down, you have patients and providers who are stuck in an unsafe place with high-dose patients. They've been on opioids for a while, treated for chronic pain, and now they're stuck. And some people on this discussion group have said, well, we really have a diagnosis of mild opioid use disorder, and we can put them on buprenorphine. And others have said, the patient doesn't accept that, it doesn't fit with the reality they've been living, they aren't shooting heroin, they aren't doing the cocaine, whatever, and then often the providers don't. And yet, if we could get those people on buprenorphine, they would do well, they would be safer. And yes, it is, I don't know, it's a unicorn. It's expedient, it's whatever it is, but I do think that it provides an opportunity to save patients' lives and to get healthcare providers comfortable using buprenorphine in an appropriate situation. So, yeah, it's not a vetted term. I personally land on the side that I think it's useful.
Good. We're going to hear from Arian.
I think David was first.
Oh, David.
Yeah, David was first.
So I think our definitions should be evidence-based. But I think there is a problem. So why not take this out of definition land and stick it somewhere else where it is in a certain sense a special population or a unique population, where it is a level, and I think there's nothing wrong with a guideline referring to ambiguities or things that are sort of on the edge, but we don't have to define it because it isn't defined. And so I think there's a discussion around this that belongs someplace, and we'll find that place, but I don't think it belongs in a definition.
So let me see, Paul, how does that work for you?
No, when you say it's an expediency, where, Anna Lemke says, we're on a hair on fire. circumstance. This is an epidemic. Anything that gets them over the butte is good to get them over the butte. I take that. It's just when we're using definitions and stuff, and we're using DSM-5, this is nowhere near that level.
Yep. So does it, maybe it addresses to take it out of a definition, this section. And then Erin.
So I think that there are more patients who fall into this category that I see. Again, falls into the special patient population, but your oncologic patient who has a history of substance abuse, maybe even in the past remotely, who now has severe oncologic disease, who requires significant analgesia and will need it persistently till they die, is a good example of this, is not someone who's going to do well with buprenorphine. There's going to be a ceiling threshold that I'm going to hit with buprenorphine that's not going to cover their pain. And while that may be a safer choice, it may not give them the quality of life and functionality that being on a high dose methadone might be for them. So a lot of those patients I'll convert on to methadone from OxyContin and take your pick of any other narcotic out there. But with our aging population and with the expectancy that the largest group in terms of by 2030, I believe oncologic disease is predicted to be one of the leading causes of death in this country. It's going to overcome hypertension, heart disease, all of those things. You're going to have a huge population of 50 to 7-year-olds in the next 2 decades who this is going to apply to in some way, shape, or form. So I agree that the definition right now is one that doesn't have a DSM, and it probably needs a whole lot more vetting. But I'm seeing this tsunami, and it's coming. And so I think that to assume that all of these patients would be better off on buprenorphine is not an accurate statement.
So it sounds to me like we have agreement that this, and push back if I'm wrong, the CPOD, we wouldn't include it in the definitions section, which is largely focused on DSMs, although we're about to move into patient abandonment, which is going to be a whole other conversation, right? But that maybe we can either let us think about where this goes. But I hear from folks that for a variety of reasons, and we can maybe even capture some of those reasons, we want folks to have some understanding that whether it's not DSM, but this is something people are seeing, and whether it's because it will get more providers engaged in this or patients engaged in this, that we have to somewhere have this captured for people, right? And whether it's in a special patient population or just something, we have to have it captured. Go ahead, Safina.
So I think if that's agreement, that's fine, but I would advocate for leaving the opioid dependence in the definition and saying that it's no longer utilizing DSM-5 and see whatever category it is, because people here might know that, but not everybody knows that, and then people are going to wonder, well, why isn't opioid dependence in there? And again, I do think that this concept of, I agree with Jim, this concept of complex persistent opioid dependence, I think might be the key in getting more and more people involved in doing, in treating opioid use disorder. This is like that gap that if we can then define it, name it, and educate around it, can get us there. So, and I think that this concept fits in that we're tapering opioid use disorder and the nebulousness in between concept that so I really want to talk about this opioid dependence at some point in the guidelines. I think it's super important.
So let me see if I heard correctly what you were saying, Safina, is we should make sure folks know that the DSM-5 isn't using opioid dependence
And
that
why?
definition.
But I think it's good to say why.
And why, and then have cross-reference to wherever this ends up, the complex opioid, the CPOD, so just cross-reference that, and it can even say, well, let's just see. I'm not gonna bring us down somewhere else, but I think that we want to include this. It doesn't necessarily belong right here, but we want to make sure folks understand that it's no longer opioid dependence isn't a term utilized by DSM-5, but we will reference this somewhere.
And that it's kind of part of opioid use disorder technically.
Yes. Yes. Okay. All right. So that's what we're going to do with that piece. Page 3. So this is a harder one. Yeah, no, so patient abandonment. This is, you said, we have a questionnaire used to develop definition. So we have, and this may be a similar question, like where does this belong? Is this a definition? Is this a process? I don't know, but let me give folks a couple minutes just to look at what we included here. And I think that there's 2 conversations. One is the content, and then 2 is where it belongs. Dana.
Just to put a finer point on that, in the resources that we were looking through, there wasn't a clear, articulate definition of patient abandonment. So instead, we pulled the sections where people talked about that. I think there could be value, personally, in naming that. It is a really important thing that I think needs to be focused on in these guidelines. But I really want to hear from all of you. Is it a discrete definition, or is it part of the bulk of the content, or both? So take a look at what we have here.
And then, so that'll be the first question, where it belongs, and then the second question will be content, although they're sort of chicken and egg, probably. Paul.
Yeah. I don't know, I can speak loud. So patient abandonment kind of intersects with forced tapers. Okay. And we're getting a lot of flack from outside the state about forced tapers. And so, this does deserve a discussion. Is a forced taper, what is a forced taper, and is a forced taper abandonment? So I think we need to be clear, because there are people going to be looking at our output. And I want to mention that if a patient's inclusion in a practice, the patient is informed that that practice utilizes CDC guidelines and will taper you or offer you a transition to buprenorphine, that's not abandonment, and that's not a forced taper if the patient decides to show up at the practice. If the patient shows up for the practice and decides to drop out, that can't be abandonment. If the patient does a partial taper and drops out, that's not abandonment, and it's not a forced taper. So I would like to weave this in with where we're going to get criticism nationally with forced tapers. I'm not advocating for a forced taper. I don't do that. I'm not in a prison where I can take a patient in and say, you're going to stop or you're going to stop. I don't think any of us are advocating for that. And I'm hoping that what the guidelines that we come up with are going to give a rational pathway that's not abandonment. It may not be what the patient wants, and it won't be a forced taper. But I think it's something that we can agree on and the board can agree on that is better for patient health or population health, but may not be what the patient wants.
Hi, this is Mark. I was hoping I could piggyback on that. Paul, your comment that the patient has to elect for that. A lot of the quote-unquote forced tapering is due to coverage by the Oregon Health Plan, and so I would posit that if you're talking about covering a tapering treatment plan for a certain period of time, that would be the patient's engagement with that. And if they choose to not comply with that, or they are not willing to do the tapering, that to me seems just like it would be that they are not choosing to engage with that patient, that practitioner's office in that tapering plan.
Go, please.
So when I saw that term, what it brought to mind was actually the legal definition, which I just pulled up, which specifically states patient abandonment is a form of medical malpractice that occurs when a physician terminates the doctor-patient relationship without reasonable notice or a reasonable excuse and fails to provide the patient with an opportunity to find a qualified replacement care provider. I would be very worried about redefining abandonment when there is a very clear legal definition that is applied to physicians and prescribers. A patient may feel abandoned, but that is not the legal definition of abandonment. So I would suggest we actually put this definition in the guideline and move away from whatever the heck this is, which I find very vague and ambiguous and subjective, from being part of that conversation. I think the legal definition is what we are going to be held to in terms of a standard, and I think when patients use that term, we should define it as it is seen in the broader context of the med legal world.
Joe.
It sounds like more of a loss, or more of a fear of the loss of treatment, or fear of the loss of my physician partner.
Right.
Rather than abandonment. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Abandonment seems like the doctor's just going to stop treating the patient. Well, it's more of the patient's fear of, you're going to stop my opioids and you're not going to be my partner anymore.
I think it's abandoning the treatment, not the provider. They're worried that that you're abandoning their opioid.
This is Dana. I spoke to a lot of people in preparation for this, knowing that I didn't come to the table with expertise. And I hear you completely. Let's not make a new definition if there's a legal definition out there. That would be very difficult. But I don't think it's my understanding, and maybe I'm not capturing the ideas here, it's not just a concern of the patient about losing their relationship on the patient side, that there's really legitimately people who are providers who are fearful about what is okay in my practice, what am I allowed to do or not, with all the changes happening nationally, and literally cutting people off with their opioids quickly, abandoning the appropriate treatment, or saying I can't take care of you. And I think that was the sense that I heard from this group at the last conversation, and a lot of people saying why we need these types of guidelines is to make sure we're not doing that. So at some point through here, I think we need to capture something about that.
So no, I agree with you completely. You know, you could think of a scenario where there's a means test, and the means test is your MA that pulls up the PDMP when a new patient calls, and they're outside CDC, and you say, I'm not going to see him. And you're outside CDC. I smell trouble coming. So that's abandonment, you know. And so we don't want that happening. Hopefully we come with guidelines that are evidence-based and consensus-based that become the standard of care. When you see that patient who's on 4,200 MED per day in your roster, that there's a rational plan, or you've got somebody that you can refer them to that can deal with that. You don't just throw up your hands and say, no, I'm not going to see that patient. I think that's abandonment, personally. I also think 10% per week is abandonment. If a patient's on high-dose opioids, that's essentially abandonment. So the tempo of the taper can also be tantamount to abandonment.
Kim, then Safina.
Yeah, I'm going to have to be the shrink and talk about abandonment through an emotional lens of a patient, which is much harder and much more nuanced than a legal definition. And it's not that I'm disagreeing with anyone who says, I'm just adding another layer of perspective. And I think when we embed guidelines, it's human nature to put them in a black and white category of this or that. And I think relationships that we have with our patients are much more complex than that. And what feels like abandonment to the patient may not be abandonment to the provider. And this goes into the art of medicine and the language in which we choose to engage our patients in this process. And that might be larger than this guideline. And maybe it's something where we link to a resource on how to have this conversation as a separate part of the guideline. But I just want to insert the voice of the patient in the process of what abandonment looks like to them. Doesn't always mesh up. It's a perspective change. And even introducing the idea of a taper feels like abandonment to our patients, even though we know we're acting in beneficence. We're trying to do no harm. We're trying to correct a wrong. So I just wanted to add that.
Safina.
Yeah, so I think that we should include the actual, like the literal definition in the definition, but do an asterisk to an additional section, maybe near the organizational supports for tapering, that talks more about the nuances of actual abandonment versus perceived abandonment versus fear of abandonment from both the patient perspective and the provider perspective, because this gets to what Dana's talking about and it gets to what Kim's talking about, but it also clarifies what is actual abandonment versus the fears of it. But I think it's worth calling out because from a provider perspective, it's absolutely true that people sometimes continue to prescribe even when they shouldn't because of that fear. And I do think it's linked to the organizational responsibility, because if you are part of an organization, your organization should have policies and processes to support both providers and patients in those decisions.
David, and then Katrina.
I think
And
we
then
got
Oh wait, I'm sorry, BJ. Go ahead. I'm sorry. BJ,
Sure,
and
yeah.
David, and Katrina.
I was just wondering, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Michelle, but as somebody who has a lot of experience coaching people through this process, do you have any perspective on what patients fear and what something that they might see in a guideline that would help them to feel comforted by that guideline, that it was for them too?
Yes, we do. I have lots of input.
I thought you might.
It really goes back to the baseline of education. I know that we have that on kind of our principles about pain education, but if we're not educating, we're really not going to move people on the spectrum at all. And it really is about medication education. And the fear is, this is all I know. This is all I know. This is all I have. What else am I going to do?
And
I don't know if that's just one small tidbit of the huge perspective of all of the things that patients fear and feel, but it really is in the tapering process and the withdrawal process. There is so much fear and emotion wrapped around it, because you're really just trying to work towards getting out of pain. That's your end goal. That everything you do is centered around that next moment of how you're going to feel in your pain.
Thanks, Michelle. David.
It seems to me we could usefully have a chapter on patient-centeredness, right? I think it's our leading principle,
Yeah.
and this is really about patient-centeredness in a very complex situation, which is not the usual. It's much more nuanced than the usual patient-centeredness conversation, and it brings up these issues. And it's really the stuff that's in here already that is not the legal definition, but it's more the psychological definition. How you navigate. And I think it would be good for these guidelines to have something that is patient-facing as well as provider-facing. And so Michelle or others can help us really get that right, and we can sort of figure out what the major issues in terms of patient-centeredness are and call them out, because I think that would be add depth to this guideline.
So the question I have for folks is, is that we have a section on patient education, but it's more than that. It's not. It's sort of patient-centeredness and then patient education.
Right. Patient education is different.
Yep.
Right. This is talking really to the providers about what patient-centeredness means.
Got it.
In this, how to stay patient-centered.
Got it.
Yeah, but there's also a part on there on provider education as well, which is part of how to have that conversation.
Right.
But I was just going to say the number one calls that we were getting at Oregon Pain Management Commission were about abandonment. And that is the biggest fear, that most of the majority of calls were about patients complaining that their doctor was abandoning them. Because of fear of prescribing,
right,
and not knowing what to do next.
So big issue. Joe?
And that's a big call that we get at the medical board. But I think that your point about abandonment is a legal definition. And I haven't seen the case of patient abandonment in 6 years. I mean, if you ask a lawyer, boy, it's hard to prove abandonment. And so we have to be careful about that use of a legal term when physicians really aren't doing that. But it's a mixture of situations.
Go ahead, Jim, and then Ariana. Oh, you, okay.
I think that, having seen patients who have come to me who felt abandoned, 2 of them who I referenced last time, who were sent to me for death with dignity because their pain meds were stopped, I think that doing the educational piece around what is the actual legal definition of abandonment versus what is a perception emotionally, psychologically of abandonment, and how to give tools to both the clinicians and the patients on how to have that dialogue effectively, so that they don't wind up truly being